Within this lesson, we're going to talk about grouping and nesting classes. And what that means is essentially that's putting them together and reusing the same properties for a number of different selectors. And simply put, it just makes them easier to manage. And we actually do have some examples that we've been using before. So one of the examples here is nesting. So we can see here that we have this selector and we have this selector inside of that particular selector. And down here at the bottom we have an example of grouping where we've separated out, we're using this selector and then we've got two additional selectors that are inside of this selector and they're just separated out by a comma. So the same thing would happen if I've added several different classes. So I've got a class of one and I'm just going to make a color and pick a color for these words, something that's going to stand out hopefully. So a green color, and I've got another one here that's 2, and I've got another one here that's 3. And so I've already added these within the HTML. So when I go over to the source, you can see that I've added in these classes too. And again, some of these classes contain more than one class. And then this is all you have to do. You just have to keep it, put a space there. And for each class, you can attach a whole bunch of additional class names to it. So here we've got 2, somewhere over here we put 1, and somewhere over here we put 3. So this one's just by itself, and then these are already placed within a class, an existing class. So now there's going to be 2 classes within this element on HTML. So and both classes are going to get applied to it. And again, it's within the order that it comes. So if one can overwrite the other, and it's again within the reading order where you're getting that first one and then the second one. And it's the same thing with the code as it's reading through it. So whatever it hits first is going to be the first styling that gets applied, and then what he hits next is going to be the next styling, and so on. So that's easy to remember and a good format to think of when you want to figure out what order all of these classes and styles are getting applied to. You can already see that our file is getting fairly large, our CSS file, and this is often the case. So sometimes when you've got stuff like this, you find that you can actually group them together. So we're going to quickly refresh the page and see that green text that we've added in. We see we've got it over there, we've got it over there, and we've got it over here. Now these ones, they actually have a different class applied. So we're just applying that color class. And again, this is in the design phase of your CSS, to design it and be able to break apart which properties you're going to need to use in order to accomplish your goals within your design. So looking at these different properties, sometimes you might look at this and say, okay, well, I want to reuse green text. I want to have the ability to call in that green text wherever I want it. So you might want to keep these classes really simple and only have that color within there. So maybe you could do something like green text or whatever you want to call it. So that's important within the design phase of your CSS. Now, in order to do grouping, all we have to do is comma separate out all the different selectors. So essentially, this would be the same thing as we had before. And because we're not going to be applying any additional properties to this, this is a really good one to use and to do that grouping with, to combine it to better manage that code. And now when we go back out to the page, hopefully we don't see anything different, and as we do see, when the page refreshes and loads, it's still got that green content, although all 3 of these classes are different classes that are pulling in this content. We've grouped them together because they are applying that similar color class and made the code a lot simpler and easier to read. So just like down here at the bottom, comma separated out, and you can apply that same property to a number of different classes. And now you can actually start getting really creative with the way that you're designing your CSS and thinking strategically what particular properties you want to break out and what particular properties you want to be able to control. And this is really crucial to when it comes to actually coming up with the CSS that you're going to be using. So in addition to grouping, what we've done here, we have what's called nesting. And so we've already been using nesting. We've used two different selectors, and we've nested the properties to the selectors within each one of the other selectors. So this doesn't necessarily get applied to all the unordered lists. It only gets applied to unordered lists that are nested within nav. And nesting essentially means that we've got the entire nav content and UL is actually nested within there. So if we had some UL that was outside, so put some in there and go back out and refresh the page. And you see that it doesn't get applied directly to it. We do have some styling that does get applied, but it's only specific to that particular nested element instead. And so besides the nested elements and the grouped elements, we also have these additional. So we see that we've got the A tag here, but we also have these additional what's called pseudo classes that are attached to the selector. So still this is the selector, but the selector has a state of hover that we've attached there, as well as a state of active. So most commonly these are being used for links, and we can specify what we want to happen if I'm on a hover, on an active, and that gives us that ability when we hover over it, it changes that background class. So this is what's known as pseudo classes, and we can really break that down, especially within links. So if we had something like nav, so we're going to group that nav again, and we've got someone that was visited, and if we want to have a particular background for only visited elements, we could do something like background color, and I'm going to pick orange. I think that's a color that it's becoming a very colorful web page, but it is actually just to illustrate all what you can do within this within CSS. Normally your color schema would be, again, strategized out before you're starting with your website, determine what colors you're using, and we're going to look at that in a later lesson as well about color schemas. I just change the font color, and then I'm going to go back and I'm just going to update some of these links to go to somewhere else so that we're not all linking back to the main page, which is the only one that we've already visited. So we can see here that this is going to be a new link, so we haven't visited it yet. So that particular pseudo class is only being applied to the visited pages, and so that's applying that color of that orange color to the text. And so besides these hyperlinks, you also have the ability to do a pseudo class on a regular selector. So you could do something like first child, and I'll see what happens here when we refresh that, and we can see that that particular styling is only going to be applied to the first child. I just had to update that, and we can see that within the div it's only being applied to this first child. So a div within a div is going to be the first child of that div, and it's only being applied to that one. So this styling now no longer is getting applied to additional divs. So within here, because we have a div within a div, so we're going to only just duplicate this out quickly just to illustrate what's happening here with the first child. Quick correction with that, because that's being applied to our first div there, and we go back out and refresh it. So I did some updates there in the code, and we can see that it's only applying it to the first child, so applying it to the first additional element within there. So here we've got that first one. So under section, the box model CSS is what's contained in there. So it's applying it to that particular div, and then the additional divs, it's not being applied. So we can see it a little bit better here when we apply it to the first child of span, and we can see that what we've done here, we've done a font weight, font size of 40. So we've just increased that particular font, and you can see here that it's applying it to that first span, just as it was doing over here within that first div. You can really begin to use those pseudo classes to really pick out those elements that you want to be using and isolate out those elements on selector. And again, it comes back to strategy and planning out how you're going to use your HTML, because of course if you're only selecting one, you might be able to use ID, and you might be able to do it by class as well, so typing in that class. But if you don't want to constantly type in these grouped classes and you want it to just go across your entire site, that's the reason for using these pseudo classes, in order to pick out and be more specific on which child of that particular selector you want to apply this styling to. So it does take a little bit of time to work with, and it is some practice that you're going to have to do with this, but it does save you time in the long run, being able to isolate these out and being able to understand the structure of how CSS can be managed.